In the early part of the 20th century, there occurred 3 civilian maritime tragedies which involved the lives of Americans. Curiously, all 3 of these maritime tragedies occurred within a 3-year time span. The first one, virtually every American is aware of. That was the sinking of the White Star Line steamer Titanic on her maiden voyage in April of 1912 as the result of striking an iceberg. The second, I think everyone knows about, that was the Cunard White Star Liner Lusitania, which went down in 18 minutes after being struck by a torpedo during the war, fired by a German U-boat in May of 1915. Only 2 months later, there occurred the third maritime tragedy in Chicago, involving many more American lives, but few Americans are aware of the scope of the third one. Just after the turn of the century, the steamer Eastland was known as the fastest passenger ship on the Great Lakes. She entered the Chicago and Lake Michigan trade in 1904 as an excursion boat. She was tall and white with 2 stacks and twin screws, that means twin propellers, at a time when most of the other passenger excursion ships, as they were called, were side wheelers, paddle wheels, and very slow. This had 2 propellers. She could make 22 knots, and when she overtook past a rival passenger ship, she had a steam calliope up on the hurricane deck, which would play "The Girl I Left Behind Me." But the Eastland had her drawbacks. Her engines burned 5 tons of coal per hour, and worse, she rode high in the water. She was top heavy. She had no keel. Doesn't that seem strange that anyone would design a ship with no keel? But the Eastland, believe it or not, did not have a keel. From the outset, there were questions about her seaworthiness among seamen all up and down the inland seas. Particularly, she was known as a difficult vessel when she was trying to dock, because in high winds, it was very difficult to pull the ship in, again, because it was so top-heavy. After 6 years of service in Chicago, the Eastland was sold to a group of Cleveland businessmen, including my own grandfather, who was one of the principal owners. The ship ran daily between Cleveland, the Chicago River, and Cedar Point, which is a resort amusement park 40 miles west of Cleveland with a beautiful beach. They would come back after that excursion, daily excursion to Cedar Point, and then dock, and then go out and have a moonlight cruise on Lake Erie. The ship failed to turn a profit in Cleveland because the winters were long, passenger service time was short, and of course the ship burned 5 tons of coal an hour. There's another problem, that the ship was owned in Cleveland by a bunch of politicians, and they tended to hand out free passes all the time, so that about half the people aboard the Eastland any given day were freebies. Eventually, in 1914, the ship was sold back to Chicago, this time to the St. Joseph and Chicago Steamship Company. It was a little firm. I think they were undercapitalized. Certainly they could not afford much insurance. On a rainy Saturday morning in July of 1915, the Western Electric Company, which was the big utility in Chicago, had booked the Eastland and 4 other excursion ships for a company picnic that was to begin with a cruise from Chicago to Michigan City, Indiana. The families packed the blankets and the picnic hampers, and they took the kids by the hand, and they made their way to the pier on the Chicago River, just west of Clark Street. By 7:15, the ship was seriously overloaded. She had, by this time, 2,500 passengers aboard. The ship was actually assigned only 350 passengers maximum. Nobody counted. Nobody counted how many tickets were sold. At 7:20, she began to lean to the port side, that is, to the left side. The ship began to tilt towards the river, Chicago Riverside. ballast water was pumped in and the ship righted itself. Then it began to lean to the starboard side. They righted it again, but the kids thought it was funny. They would squeal with delight as they saw the lemonade stands roll from one side of the deck to the other. At 7:23 in the morning of July 20th, 1915, with the ship still tied to the dock, the Eastland once more listed sharply to the port side. The captain shouted from the bridge to open the inside doors and let the people out. But it was too late because the ship was no longer attached to the gangplank. It was up above the gangplank. Death came that morning in slow motion. The ship leaned toward the river at angles of 20, then 30, then 40 degrees. In the final seconds, the Eastland rolled over and settled on her side in 21 feet of water. 812 people drowned that day. By Monday, the death toll had reached 835. In a scene of incredible tragedy, the relatives of the drowned victims came to identify the bodies in the little temporary morgues that they had built. The little girls were still in their blue and pink pinafore dresses with the bows tied in the back. The little boys were still in their sailor suits with the Buster Brown collars. It was an incredibly tragic story. What made the Eastland tragedy so incomprehensible was that it took place in the heart of a major city, in view of passerby on the bridge, in view of people up in the office buildings looking down and people in the apartments looking down. Even more incomprehensible was the fact that the tragedy took place not at sea, not as a result of a terrible storm or an iceberg or a torpedo, but while the ship was still tied to the dock. Well, eventually the victims were buried. There was little or no insurance to pay the families of the victims. Curiously, the Eastland itself was righted, stripped of her top-heavy upper deck, and sold to the U.S. Navy as a training vessel. Thus reconfigured, the Eastland sailed for another 150,000 miles, had a different name, of course, before being taken out of service in 1948. She never had another accident. My grandfather, who had been one of her owners in Cleveland, never in his life would discuss the Eastland. I think even more curious is the fact that very few Americans know about the Eastland. There's never been, to my knowledge, a novel or a documentary written about it or a TV show. Most people don't know about the Eastland, yet it was the worst of our maritime tragedies in the 20th century. Not only do most Americans not know about it, but very few citizens of Chicago know anything about the Eastland. There is, they did have briefly a plaque on the river just west of Clark Street, which said this is where the Eastland turned over. But more recently, the last time I was there, the plaque has been removed, so there is virtually no monument to the Chicago tragedy, which took the lives of 835 people.